for the my subconscious dislike of them. It makes me forget. Can you hear? No. Well, it's on. It's on. Can you hear now? Yes. Properly? That's how we're going to have to pitch it, is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Well, it's my... that's the reason. Is that better? No. That's not better. That is. Good. Okay. Miracle worker. It's my huge pleasure to introduce Paul Fidders. I first came across his writings when I was doing my theology degree donkeys years ago and read The Creative Suffering of God, which is absolutely life-changing. So if you're into that sort of thing, I still recommend that book. Lots of other publications, too long to list here, but he is an extremely distinguished scholar, and I am very, very grateful to him for coming to give this talk, not least on the war poets, which of course touch our hearts in a way that perhaps some other things don't. And we're going to get some theology, you'll be glad to know. So, over to you, Paul.
Thank you. If you'd like to take part in this series, and perhaps at the beginning I should warn you that the writing isn't all as large as that on this screen, so if you know that you have problems with your sight, may I urge you to come forward a bit so you can see the screen clearly. I don't mind if you move actually during the talk, if you find you can't read. On the evening of 4th of August this year, a service was held in Westminster Abbey to commemorate the outbreak of the Great War on that very same day a century ago. As the clock moved forward to the fateful hour of 11 p.m. when war was declared, 1,000 candles were slowly extinguished, one by one, in the great space of the Abbey, recalling the remark of Sir Edward Grey at the time that the lights are going out all over Europe. At the climax, just before the last candle was snuffed out, the choir sang a new anthem commissioned for the occasion, music by David Matthews. The composer's grandfather had been killed in the First World War, and he was setting words by the poet Harold Munro, who had fought in the war. This was the poem. To what God shall we chant our songs of battle? Oh, to whom shall a song of battle be chanted? Not to our Lord of hosts on his ancient throne, drowsing the ages out in heaven alone. The celestial choirs are mute, the angels have fled. Word is gone forth abroad that our Lord is dead. I wonder if you regard this as an odd choice, perhaps even out of place on such an occasion, striking a jarring note. The BBC, broadcasting the service on television, didn't put the words on the screen, and most viewers would have had no idea that at this most solemn moment of remembrance, the choir was singing a protest song against God. I do regard the anthem as completely fitting for the time and place. It reminds us that the poets of the First World War wanted to talk to God about the horrors they were experiencing. And they wanted to talk about God in the context of suffering. Often the talk was a protest, although sometimes it was a kind of doubting faith, a tentative and ambiguous belief, as in this poem by Edmund Blunden, who also fought in the trenches. I have been young, and now am not too old, and I have seen the righteous forsaken, his health, his honour, and his quality taken. This is not what we were formerly told. I have seen a green country, useful to the race, knocked silly with guns and mines, its villages vanquished, even the last rat and last kestrel banished. God bless us all. This was peculiar grace. Say what you will, our God sees how they run. These disillusions are his curious proving that he loves humanity and will go on loving. Over there are faith, life, virtue in the Son. Here Blunden can find no clear evidence for the love of God in the scenes of destruction around him, and here he lacks the confidence of the writer of Psalm 37, whom he contradicts. But something still urges him to believe despite the evidence. There must, he thinks, be something more than this, something over there. The ravaged world around him can't be the whole story. But whether a mood of protest or a questioning trust, the poets find that they need to keep the conversation going, to talk about God and suffering. Well, my aim today is to share in that conversation. I want to take the opportunity of a commemorative year to reflect on a Christian approach to the problem of suffering in human life. My intention isn't to think directly about the ethics of war, but to think theologically about the problem of suffering that war raises so sharply. Our suffering may not be of the same kind as the soldiers of World War I, but it will have its own agonies. The testimony of the war poets will help us to ground our theology in concrete reality, or perhaps, in the context of the trenches, I should say, muddy reality. Now let's be clear, right at the beginning, that all talk about suffering fails in the end. No religious argument about the reasons for suffering is finally convincing. We can't finally explain how a good God could make a world in which there is pain. Blunden, in his poem, speaks about a curious proving. He doesn't have proof of the love of God in the normal sense of the word. It's impossible, finally, to solve the problem of suffering, and it may actually be harmful to try and do so. If we have cast iron intellectual arguments to explain suffering, we may end up by accepting it and justifying it. Christian thinkers in the majority world today, what we used to call the third world, are especially critical of the way that Western Christians spend so much time and effort trying to solve the problem of suffering. The point, they say, is not to explain suffering, but to remove it. Especially we need to tackle the deep underlying issues of poverty, injustice and inequality that cause suffering in our world. We're so busy making our clever theologies that we fail to transform the financial and political structures that are oppressing people. But if we're Christian believers, we do need to talk about the relation of God to suffering in our world. If God is at the heart of life, then we need to express how we feel about where God is in a situation of suffering. That's what the poets of the World War I tell us, that they had to bring God into the conversation, to put God on the scene, even on the spot. And it's no less true for us. Suppression is unhealthy. And any burying of resentments and protests about suffering will only break out in destructive form. Sufferers are often driven into silence and brooding, and they lose communication with other people and with God. Having some idea of how God, as creator and supreme lover of humankind, relates to suffering, may help us to re-establish that communication at the right time. There will be a proper time for such understanding, and it probably won't be the actual moment of acute suffering. It wasn't at the moment of going over the top in the First World War. It won't be for us at the actual moment of the loss of a child, or the sudden loss of a partner in middle life, or the sudden discovery of having a terminal illness. but at some time it may help to reflect in a thoughtful way on the relation of God to suffering in our world. The pain of individuals who are ill, the anguish of a genocide in Rwanda or Kosovo or now in Iraq, the obscenity of a Holocaust, the awful tragedy of an earthquake. I began by saying that no argument put up by the Christian faith is finally convincing. We can't fully explain suffering and evil, but a thoughtful faith may help to move us towards the point where we can go on living in the world with trusting God. It may help to see that belief in a divine creator is at least reasonable and consistent about the way we know the world works. We can talk about God and suffering just a little. We're embarked this lunchtime on a very modest theodicy, not justifying God in the face of suffering, but trying to talk about God and suffering in one breath. And so we move on to something that lies at the heart of a Christian view of the world, which is the freedom of creation, the argument from free will. In beginning to grapple generally with the mystery of evil and suffering, Christianity affirms that God is the kind of creator who makes a universe which has a great deal of its own freedom to be itself. In the Christian view, God's purpose in making the universe was to make many living beings with whom to enter into relationship. Beings who could enjoy the fellowship of divine love, such as God knows in God's own being. The Christian vision of God is of a divine life, which is relational. The Christian picture of God as Trinity portrays a dynamic interweaving or dance of relationships, relationships of giving and receiving in love, like those between a father and a son, or a parent and child, a mother and daughter, in an eternal spirit of newness and hope. Created beings are made to join this fellowship. They're invited into an eternal fellowship of love and joy. Among those beings are the personal beings we call human, men and women. They have a special place in creation with special tasks and responsibilities, though the Christian faith makes clear that God enjoys a relationship with all living things, the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the lamb and the tiger, as William Blake puts it. Now, persons need a great deal of freedom. They can't be controlled like puppets or robots, but must be free to make their own decisions. They also need to be free in order to be creative, to make new things that will contribute to God's own project in creation. Whether these new things are paintings, poems, and music, or a technology which will make for better living conditions for people. The Christian view of the world is that God wants created beings to share in an act of ongoing creation. The point is that freedom like this will involve suffering, in at least two ways. And in thinking about these, I must ask your patience in not returning just yet to the war poets, because I want to do a bit of theological thinking first. First, there is the suffering that seems to be built into the very process of growth and development. In the evolution of sentient beings, let alone persons, there's a painful journey in which sacrifices have to be made by some for the sake of others. Some species die out for others to have a chance of life. So a certain amount of suffering seems to belong to the very emergence of life with all its possibilities. If creation is to be free, then there is also randomness and chance in events, a chaotic element that will in itself create some pain. Mental fatigue may cause a brake to fail just at the moment when a bus is passing through a busy street. Further, if human beings are to develop as moral persons, then some suffering seems to be necessary to help this growth. Mechanics are not going to develop a sense of moral responsibility for the passengers of buses unless there is the danger of mental fatigue. Sailors are not going to develop a sense of responsibility for their ships unless there are storms they have to contend with, and storms cause damage. At the simplest level, if fire didn't cause pain to human skin, we might always be putting ourselves into it and losing limbs. This kind of suffering is often called natural evil, but I think it would be better to call it natural suffering. A suffering which belongs to the very fabric of nature. It also seems to belong to the process of education, making us what we are as human persons. And whole philosophical theories have been built on that perception. However, such suffering can become evil. It's an evil when it's excessive, when it's far more damaging than seems to be necessary. And that's exactly how natural suffering often seems to be to us. The shifting of tectonic plates or ocean surges might be educational for us. It should teach us not to build flimsy buildings in earthquake zones or on low-lying ground. But we feel this isn't the whole story. So much harm is done to poor and innocent people who are forced there to live in unsatisfactory conditions in Haiti or along the coast of Bangladesh. Educational theories of suffering that philosophers are so fond of seem cold and abstract, not meeting the reality of human life. And even among non-human animals, in the forest or the jungle, there seems far too much pain in the natural world. So there's a second way in which freedom leads to suffering, and this has a lot of emphasis in the Christian faith. That is, there's a terrible risk that creatures will misuse their freedom. They'll turn away from the good purposes of the Creator and work out their own selfish desires. This is often called moral evil. Now, the poets of war are often acutely conscious of human moral responsibility for the suffering they and others are enduring. Here, for example, is Thomas Hardy, picturing the dead who are sleeping in their tombs in church and being woken up at the sound of the big ship's guns firing across the channel. That night your great guns unawares shook all our coffins as we lay, and broke the chancel window squares. We thought it was the judgment day, and sat upright, till God called, no, it's gunnery practice out at sea. Just as before you went below, the world is as it used to be. All nations striving strong to make red war yet redder. Mad as hatters, they do no more for Christus' sake than you who are helpless in such matters. Ha ha, it will be warmer when I blow the trumpet, if indeed I ever do, for you are men, and rest eternal sorely need. Human beings, God declares in this poem, are mad as hatters, while he will be generous with the true last judgment. Christian thinkers have maintained that to be real persons we have to be created free to do either good or evil. The only other option is a world of puppets or robots. If doing the right is to have any meaning, there must be the alternative of doing the wrong, evil, with all the suffering this entails. We have to be free to be morally mad as hatters. Immediately, I suggest we can see two problems with the way this argument is often put. If it's to have any force at all in explaining suffering, this argument for freedom, then I think we have to modify it in two ways. First, this argument mustn't be taken to mean that any particular sufferer has used his or her freedom to do something wrong, and that's why they're suffering. The point is rather that mankind as a whole has used its freedom to turn away from God's purpose. Those who suffer may well be the victims of other people's sin, either in the present or perhaps through a legacy left from the past in social or genetic disorders, like landmines left in the soil for unwary people to tread on. Things have gone wrong in the misuse of God-given freedom, but we can't fully trace where things have gone wrong. We may be the victims of a very complicated story that's developed over thousands, even millions of years. The war poets have a vivid sense of the combatants as victims of the moral choices of others, not their own. And second, this argument from free will doesn't seem to cover the suffering that comes from non-human causes, natural suffering. I mean viruses that cause AIDS, cancerous cells, microbes, and on a larger scale, earthquakes and floods. We can make human beings at least partly responsible for these by saying that if human persons had obeyed God, as they ought to have done, then they could have worked together with God to overcome these disorders in nature. Human sinfulness does make destructive elements in nature worse. It's because of sin that human beings build cities on earthquake fault lines and are so concerned with gathering riches that they don't spend enough money on eradicating causes of disease. But not everything can be blamed on human sinfulness. Disorders and chaos are there beyond the human world. For this free will argument to work to cover all evil and suffering, we must take the freedom of all creation seriously. I've suggested that freedom means the pain of growth and the pain of randomness. Chance can be cruel. But more than this, we must also say, I believe, that the whole of creation has drifted away from God's purpose. It isn't just human beings who fail to respond to God's aims for wholeness and life. But in some way, creation at every level has slipped away from God's vision for a good creation. We must conceive of God's Spirit at work in the whole of the physical world, urging it towards flourishing and fullness of life, calling for cooperation and partnership in a way appropriate for its level of being. Everything can respond in some way to this divine summons, though human beings have the greatest capacity for doing so. The Bible puts this poetically, saying that God has made a covenant not only with human beings, but with every living creature, the birds, the cattle, the beasts of the earth. Not only human beings, but the whole world of nature sings praise to God. The waves roar before him, the heavens pour forth speech, the trees of the fields clap their hands, he comes to his world, and God plays with the sea monsters in the deep. In the New Testament, according to Paul in Romans chapter 8, the whole universe is groaning as in childbirth, waiting for God to set it free with its destiny deeply bound up with the redemption of God's human children. This is certainly poetic language, but it offers testimony to some kind of response that the natural world can make or fail to make to the purposes of God. Because it has failed to respond to the urgings of the Holy Spirit, we may say there is far too much pain in the world. That's why floods and microbes cause so much harm. When we suffer, I suggest, we're the victims of a very long story in which human beings are not the only characters. War is a particularly intense conjunction of all these ideas of the exercise of freedom in creation. Isaac Rosenberg, in his poem Dead Man's Dump, strains language to express the interaction between human beings and the natural world. Through image, rather than argument, he implies there's a kind of responsibility for wrong choices and lack of love that is shared by all, while humanity is especially culpable. Maniac earth, howling and flying, your bowels seared by the jagged fire, the iron love, the imperious storm of savage love. Dark earth, dark heavens, swinging in chemic smoke, What dead are born when you kiss each soundless soul with lightning and thunder from your mind-heart, which man's self dug and his blind fingers loosed? A man's brains spattered on a stretcher-bearer's face. His shook shoulders slipped their load, but when they bent to look again, the drowning soul was sunk too deep for human tenderness. This argument for the freedom of the world and all its creatures is the basic Christian understanding of suffering. This is the big idea. God doesn't send suffering or make people suffer. The question, why has God done this, is a mistake. God hasn't, or at least not directly, not here and now as a kind of plan for our life. I want to make a definite statement here that you're very welcome to challenge afterwards. God never inflicts suffering, not even for reasons that, as people say, he knows best. But someone may say, why doesn't God intervene to stop it? If he doesn't cause suffering, why doesn't he prevent it? This was a constant plea of the poets. Siegfried Sassoon writes, men jostle and climb to meet the bristling fire. Lines of grey, muttering faces, masked with fear, they leave their trenches going over the top, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists, and hope, with furtive eyes and grappling fists, flounders in mud. Oh, Jesus, make it stop! Why doesn't God make it stop? The answer lies, I believe, in what I've been saying about the freedom that God gives to creation and God's decision only to work in partnership with the world, in cooperation with the creatures God has made. In God's free decision to be a creator, God has limited God's self to working together with creation. To allow his creation to grow and develop, God has made the fundamental decision to which God remains faithful. Not to act in a unilateral way, but only to act in persuasive love. God, by God's own choice to be a creator, cannot intervene. But God can do new things in the world, even miraculous things, when God has the cooperation that God wants. God's resources of love are endless, and the pressure of his love on the world can wear down the most stubborn resistance. But God still remains vulnerable to the response of created beings, and they may go on resisting the divine love. Who can doubt that, faced with the mountain of misery of a Passion Day or a Holocaust or a genocide, that God wanted to move human wills to prevent these evils? We have to say that the weight of resistance to God's purpose in these cases meant that God could not shift the obstacle and have God's way. This is what St. Paul calls the weakness and the foolishness of God. In human eyes, that is. For we measure power by the ability to get our own way. God is all-powerful, omnipotent enough to be able to give mere force away. But of course you can see that this Christian argument about freedom doesn't let God off the hook. God is still to some extent in the dock. God's choice to make a free world had a terrible risk in it. Things could go badly wrong, and they have. In choosing to create, God opened up the possibility for suffering. While the emergence of evil is not absolutely necessary in our world, it's very likely to develop through free choices when human beings are immature and the divine glory is veiled. In short, God took a considerable risk. War, above all, shows the extent of this risk. This divine responsibility is expressed in a number of war poems. We've already seen a hint of it in Harold Munro's poem with which I began. And here is Edward Thomas prompted in his thoughts by hearing the roar of a flock of starlings in an oak tree, which sounds like the noise of water. Time swims before me, making as a day 1,000 years, while the broad ploughland oak roars mill-like, and men strike and bear the stroke of war as ever, audacious or resigned. And God still sits aloft in the array that we have wrought him, stone deaf and stone blind. Thomas seems to recognize that the image of an all-powerful God up aloft on a throne is something we have projected onto God. We have wrought him. But God here, you see, still doesn't escape blame. And that's why there can be no final intellectual answer to the problem of suffering. The question remains, is it worth it? In using theological arguments, as I've been doing, we may talk of the risk that God took in creation, but it still remains open to decide whether God's decision to create is worth the cost. In Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, one of the characters, Ivan, asks the question, is the whole universe worth the tears of one tortured child? He has in mind the story of a rich landowner who threw a peasant child to his dogs to be torn apart by them because the child had thrown a stone and broken a dog's leg. The mother had to look on while the child was tortured and killed. Is the universe worth the tears of one child, let alone the millions in Auschwitz in our day? Ivan thinks not, and says that he is returning his entrance ticket to God with the polite observation that the price is too steep. Is it worth it? Wilfred Owen rewrites the story of the book of Genesis, in which Abraham is first commanded by God to sacrifice his son, but then has his hand stayed at the last minute by the provision of another victim, a ram caught in a bush. In Owen's version, Abraham continues with the human sacrifice, as have the old men in command of the nations of Europe in our day. Behold, calls an angel from heaven, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. We can't here miss the poet's attribution of blame, not only to the leaders of nations, but to the God who has set the whole situation up in the first place, and who's made it possible for the Abrahams of our day to succumb to their pride. Is it worth it? We may say that the making of persons is worth all the tears, the delights of human love, the satisfactions of family life, the beauty of art, the joy of communion with God makes it all worth it. But it's a leap of faith to say this. The faith that comes from looking into the face of God. Only faith can answer this question, is it worth it? After all reasonable arguments have fallen silent. And part of that faith is a proper kind of protest. To assign responsibility to God is a healthy religious feeling which ought not to be suppressed. Let me give you an example of this. About 10 years ago, I read in a national newspaper the comments of a social worker who serves the wards of a hospice, caring for the dying. She had to cope with the distress of patients slowly wasting away from cancer. She had to cope with difficult relatives. She wrote that the only thing that had kept her going through all this was that she was a Christian believer, a Roman Catholic. She said, I'm very sure of the existence of a God, and that means I've got somebody to be flaming mad with. We catch the same note in a poem by Robert Graves, reflecting on the way that war shows us the true significance of things that we might otherwise overlook. And old importances came flooding back. Wine, meat, log files, a roof over the head, a weapon at the thigh, surgeons at call. Even there was a use again for God, a word of rage in lack of meat, wine, fire, in ache of wounds beyond all surgeoning. Now let's take our thought one stage further, beyond God as a word of rage. If God has indeed taken such a risk in the making of the world, then I believe that the problem of suffering cannot even be considered without the idea of the suffering of God or the self-emptying of God. In recent years, it seemed to many theologians and to many ordinary religious people that we can't make any sense of human suffering without believing that God suffers with creation. As the God of love, God must share the suffering that flows from the risk. If God is finally, though not immediately, responsible for the way that creation is, God must take responsibility. Only the fact that God suffers in God's own self can, I think, make credible the tracing of suffering to the free will of creation. If a God of love exposes creation to risk, God will face the risk with those whom God has made. God will join those who protest against suffering as an alien feature in creation. God too protests against the damage to what God has made. In Christian tradition, this belief is expressed in the story of the cross of Jesus. God is identified with the man who hangs on the cross as a victim of human hatred. In Christ, deserted by both enemies and friends, God experiences the utter limit of desolation and abandonment. An early Christian thinker, the Apostle Paul, puts it like this: God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. The cross of Jesus, as the cross of the Son of God, tells us that God takes responsibility. One modern songwriter, Sidney Carter, has a song called "It Was a Friday Morning," and the singer is complaining about all that's wrong with the world. The refrain goes like this: "It's God they ought to crucify instead of you and me, I said to the carpenter hanging on the tree." And the hearer says to himself, well, God was crucified. It's God they ought to crucify. This sentiment becomes unhealthy, of course, when it's used to excuse human beings from their own responsibility for their own free choices. But nevertheless, the urge to trace responsibility for suffering to God in an ultimate manner is, I think, an essential part of any free will defence of suffering. And it can only be met by the conviction that God also suffers. God has always been sharing the suffering of the world. It didn't happen alone in the crucifixion of Jesus. But here Christians see that fellowship of suffering expressed most clearly. The conviction that the only God worth believing in was a suffering God emerged strongly from the experience of the First World War. Here is Max Plowman writing in 1917. "Not for me, the thought, your mother made your bodies, God your souls, and because you dutifully fought, God will go mad and make of half-lives wholes. No, God in every one of you was slain, for killing men is always killing God. Though life destroyed shall come to life again, and loveliness rise from the sodden sod. But if of life we do destroy the best, God wanders wide and weeps in his unrest." And here's Isaac Rosenberg again. "Red fangs have torn his face, God's blood is shed. He mourns from his lone place, his children dead." To us today it seems that truly personal love must involve the suffering of the one who loves. The world being what it is, love must be costly and sacrificial, if only in terms of mental pain. Love is the sharing of experience and mutuality of feeling. Sympathy must be taken in its literal sense of suffering with, so that simply to be aware of the suffering of another will mean a participation in that suffering. So even when life is running smoothly, love always means being changed by the other, and this means suffering the impact of another on one's own life. To love is to be in relationship where what the loved one does alters one's own experience. If this is true of human beings made in God's image, we must surely say the same of God, who is supremely love. But this is where objections might arise to the idea that God suffers, and I'm not to mention just one of these that might be raised, and you may have others to mention afterwards. Can a suffering God overcome evil? That's the question. Is God destined forever to be the victim of the very universe that God has made? I've been proposing that the purposes of God can be frustrated in the short term, and that we're bound to say this because of the tragedies of the world. With agony in the divine heart, God cannot, in some circumstances, shift the weight of resistance to the divine love. So is this the whole story? Has God taken such a risk that the whole enterprise of creation will come to nothing? This issue is raised acutely by war. War promotes the sense that evil will never come to an end, that the same old story will be told over and over again to the last moment of recorded time. Wilfred Owen captures this feeling in his poem, Exposure. It seems to him that the whole universe is in the trenches and can never emerge from them, that the love of God and all the hopes of God's springtime are dying along with him and his fellow soldiers, and nothing new can happen. Pale flakes with finger in stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in halls back on forgotten dreams, and stare snow days deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we're dying? Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit, for God's invincible spring, our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grass, pours over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Will nothing else ever happen? Well, we must ask what it would mean for evil to be overcome. And that would surely be for all created beings, whether human or not, to turn in trust and obedience to the Creator, for them to be restored to fellowship with God, to cooperate with the Creator's project in creation. Evil isn't a thing, a substance to be wiped out like removing a piece of dirt. It's an attitude of rebellion against the good, a failure of response to the gift God offers. Response isn't something that can be compelled. It needs the persuasion of love, creating an answering love, and transformation in free personalities and other beings. Now, we know from our experience that without empathy, we cannot create response in those who are hostile to us and draw them into fellowship with us. We have to identify with them, enter into their feelings, to win them into relationship. And that's a costly business involving suffering. In the the same way, only a God who suffers can overcome evil. Only a God who participates with painful love in the lives of creatures can influence them to accept the love offered to them. It's not that God overcomes evil despite suffering. God overcomes evil through suffering. That's the Christian's wager, that suffering love is the strongest power in the universe. Faith bets on love. It dares to risk everything on the belief that love must overcome evil in the end. That given enough time and costly sacrifice, love conquers all. The Christian faith has a whole rainbow of colourful pictures to try and express how this suffering of God makes a difference to human suffering. And here finally are just two ways we might conceive of this difference. First, it offers consolation to those who suffer, to know that God suffers too, and so understands their situation from within. The Hebrew book of Job offers no answer to the problem of suffering, but only an assurance that the sufferer isn't deserted by God, that God is still with Job despite everything. Christian faith deepens this companionship of God by assuring the sufferer that God is suffering alongside him or her. So a theologian of our day, Jürgen Moltmann, remarks that the Shema of Israel and the Lord's Prayer were prayed in Auschwitz, and that there would be no theology after Auschwitz if there had been no theology in Auschwitz. Leading on from consolation is what we might call the power of story. Again, we make no attempt to produce a rational argument about the problem of evil and suffering. Instead, we simply appeal to the power of the story of the suffering of God, which can help us to find some meaning in the story of our own lives and our own suffering. Much of human suffering appears meaningless. It isn't heroic, not part of a great crusade, not the death of a martyr giving himself or herself for a glorious cause. Suffering just befalls us, and because we can't see the sense of it, we're driven into silence. We're numbed by suffering, paralysed in our will and our emotions. The war poets often dwell on the apparent lack of meaning in the stories of those who die. They're labourers, ploughmen, farmers, clerks, mechanics thrust into war. They come from unknown, unnoticed lives, and they disappear into the unknown. Here's Siegfried Sassoon again in his poem, The Working Party. He was a young man with a meagre wife and 2 small children in a Midland town. He showed their photographs to all his mates, and they considered him a decent chap who did his work and hadn't much to say, and always laughed at other people's jokes because he hadn't any of his own. That night when he was busy at his job of piling bags along the parapet, he thought how slow time went, stamping with his feet and blowing on his fingers, pinched with cold. And as he dropped his head, the instant split his startled life with lead, and all went out. We may feel that, like this man, we've made no great entrance on the stage of suffering humanity, or made no heroic exit. And now we may be helped to cope with suffering and find some hope in the midst of it if we place alongside our story a greater story, a story of suffering which does have meaning. God's story of suffering has an aim in view, to transform human existence by the power of sacrificial love, to bring resurrection life out of the worst kind of death. Hearing the story of the suffering of God can help us to find meaning in our stories. But if we follow this line of thought, we must be very careful to stress that we're talking about each person finding a meaning for himself or herself, not having some meaning thrust upon them. We can never say to a sufferer, in the light of the suffering of God, this must be the meaning for your suffering. But our suffering can acquire a meaning. We can put the story of God's suffering alongside our apparently senseless suffering and see what meaning emerges. we can see how this terrible situation can be redeemed and good even brought out of evil. And then we might be able to say, yes, it is worth it. But it'll be a yes of faith, a daring step over the precipice of suffering.
For a very profound presentation, which I'm sure has given lots of us thoughts. If I may just say one thing as you were talking towards the end, I was reminded of the story in Elie Wiesel's Night,
yes,
where a young, in case you haven't heard this one, a young lad is hanged for misdemeanors of somebody who wouldn't own up in Auschwitz. And one rabbi, if I've got the story right, one rabbi says to another, "Where is God now?" And the reply is, "There he is, hanging on the tree." I know this is ambiguous, but I have always taken it to be complete identification with suffering.
Though remember that Elie himself said that that was the event that made him into an atheist. He said it killed all his belief in God, because for him God was dead. Like the boy, dead to the world. So I think that it's a great story, and I'm so glad you've quoted it. I think it shows us we need to make this leap over the precipice. That's the point where faith really is required, and argument fails, even at that time. That's a great story, and I'm so grateful for your mentioning it. Yeah.
Can I take some questions from the floor? Or comments?
Yes, thank you.
We cherish, celebrate, question these words of the First World War poets that we've so brilliantly encapsulated here. And I'm wondering whether there are parallels from more contemporary conflicts, whether you're aware of poetry that can teach us as much about conflict in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria at the moment. And that, of course, could be from all faiths.
Yes.
Maybe not necessarily the religions of the book, maybe we could go beyond it to Buddhist thinking in Sri Lanka or in Burma or wherever. So I'm just wondering how much we might draw on today.
Yes. Well, thank you. And books have been published on poetry that's come out of these different theatres of war. You have to go backwards and you can find them there, actually. There have been poems published precisely for that situation. And I could obviously have based what I had to say on one of those examples. But here we are commemorating 100 years, so that's why I chose the First World War poets. But that's absolutely so. And I'd also very much agree with you about what I wanted to say really as being witnessed to by all the religions of the world. Some religions, such as Islam, are much more wary of talking about the suffering of God, but they do talk profoundly about the compassion of God. And something of what I wanted to say about sharing in human life, and the same questions of responsibility are there in all religions. So I also wanted to say that from a Christian perspective, God doesn't only suffer in the cross of Jesus.
Stunned into silence.
Yes. Thank you. Do you have another question? Yeah, lady here. Yeah. Great.
What if you don't have faith? How can you then join that person in going over the edge? I mean, I'm thinking of perhaps a child with leukemia who's dying.
Yes.
How can you
Yes.
be with those parents when they don't have faith?
Yes. Well, I did say, didn't I, that as Christian believers, it's a good thing for us to think reasonably about God and suffering, because it helps us as Christian believers to put things in a whole context. But the moment when someone is suffering may not be the right moment to bring forward reasonable arguments. And I think at that stage, it's our own, I think, view of the world that enables us to be alongside people in that situation and to feel with them, to be alongside them. If we're Christian believers, I think we believe that God is also alongside them. They don't have to believe that for that to be true. They don't have to believe that to be embraced in the love of God, and we can begin to communicate that ourselves. So, of course, there are many in our world who suffer without any kind of religious belief at all. What I'm asking is, those of us who are here are Christian believers, how do we approach that? How do we think about God and the suffering world together? I mean, we certainly don't need to impose our faith on others in order for the relation of God to the world to be true. It's true whether people know it or believe it or not. And to be with people, to communicate that in our very being, is what is important.
Yes, and in any pastoral context, the being alongside is the important thing, but the only response apart from that is silence. Really.
Yes. But it'll help us, I think, to be alongside in that pastoral silence if we ourselves have some kind of framework of understanding. That's what I wanted to say. It's not a proof, it's not a cast iron argument, but it's a framework of thinking.
I followed your argument most of the time. I appreciated it very much. There was one thing I had a question about. Could you say a bit more about, I understood you were saying that creation itself has slipped away from God's will.
Yes.
Could you just say a little bit more about that, please? Because I didn't understand that.
Well, when I say it has, of course this is again one of those unprovable things. I'm asking what a consistent Christian view of the world would be, which of course is not a matter of empirical proof. And I was saying that if Christians are going to take a free will argument, that a powerful reason for the presence of suffering in the world is the freedom of creation, that argument only begins to make sense if you consider the whole of creation as having that freedom. However difficult it is to think it. Otherwise, I think you have to give up the free will argument. Because we're embedded in the natural world, and we've emerged from the natural world. We're not somehow living in a different world from the world of nature. And this is what evolution has told us over the last 150 years of reflection on that. And so if we have the freedom to rebel against God, that can only be true, I think, if the whole of creation has a similar freedom. Now, the problem is, of course, how to begin to think that. I suggested the Bible thinks it poetically, and the Bible is full of these descriptions of everything in creation being related to God, and either going along with the purpose of God or not. I mean, it's there in the Psalms of the Old Testament and in New Testament perceptions as well, so it can be expressed poetically. There have been attempts to try and think it scientifically in such philosophies as process philosophy, which thinks of everything as having some desire to flourish within it, which is not consciousness, not like a human mind, but it is in a kind of inherent desire to come to fullness and to completion that can cooperate with God. But that others are not convinced by that kind of semi-scientific explanation. And I'm not totally convinced by that either. But you see, it's what one is compelled to think, really. I think I'd have to give up the argument from free will altogether if it were just restricted to human beings, because it really wouldn't make sense. It makes human beings too isolated from the rest of the world. Of course, that was the view of the Enlightenment, that as thinking minds, we were totally separate from everything else. You know, we were just unique in the world. We We had no connection with nature. Nature was there to be manipulated by us and used by us. You know, we are the superior thinking minds. The whole ecological movement has shown us that we can't think of human beings like that. It leads to disaster if we do. So we're embedded in the natural world, though we have very special gifts and have emerged in many ways from it. So my argument is that really this argument for freedom only makes sense if you can extend it in this way, even though it's difficult to conceive of it. But then you might say it's just as difficult to conceive of human freedom. After all, the philosophers wrangle for ages about whether we are really free and how you can conceive of human moral freedom. So that's a highly contested idea. I don't think it's more contestable because that everything has freedom in this way. But I did suggest that at the ground base of this freedom there is randomness and chaos. So that's there. And again, you have to ask the question, is it worth it? God has clearly made a creation which has a great deal of randomness and chaos. And a lot of suffering is caused by that. So you come back again to the question, well, was it worth it? But I wanted to say that as well as that randomness of freedom, there is something like a lack of response to God, even though it's very difficult to express how that might be the case. Yeah.
We need to end, but I wonder if we dare raise the words of Mother Julia as the final word, that all shall be right. And all manner of things shall be right.
Wonderful words, yes. And that, of course, is the affirmation of faith that it is worth it. All will be well, and all manner of things will be well. But it is a walking over the precipice, isn't it, to be able to say that. They're words I certainly want to echo. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We have been enriched by your wise and scholarly words and the poetry, of course. Thank you all for coming. Do come again next week.